What is happening, you beautiful bastards? Welcome back to another week. This week, we talked to a very interesting man named Alonzo Wind. Who is
Yeah.
Alonzo?
So Alonzo, so this is kind of a mouthful. I'm just going to read it right off the screen here. Alonzo Wind is a retired senior foreign service officer from the U.S. Agency for International Development. And now you know why I had to read that. So he basically is all about foreign aid, especially with respect to the U.S. giving foreign aid to other countries. So we kind of talk about, in this one, I'd say we go in depth into why we should do foreign aid, why it's not a waste of money, and maybe you feel it is, maybe you don't. But when we talk to Alonzo, he kind of breaks it down for us on what the actual benefit is besides just throwing money out the window at other countries. It's a little bit more complicated than that.
And we get to hear all of his messed up stories of everywhere he's been.
Yeah, and this man has been everywhere. So,
literally.
I don't know, you kind of go everywhere with him. So it's a pretty in-depth conversation about a lot of different things.
Definitely.
So let's check it out.
What is happening, you beautiful bastards?
Alonzo, how you doing?
Good afternoon. Good to meet you, Jerry and Gris. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Oh, thanks for being on the show. We were looking forward to talking to you today. So you've got a new book out, right?
I do. It was released last year in English and Spanish, and earlier this year in an audiobook version.
Interesting. So how long has that book been out now?
Well, the book was first released just over a year ago.
Over a year, okay. And so Andy and I have not had a chance to read it. So can you give us a brief summary of what the book is actually about before we get into the rest of the conversation today?
Absolutely. Well, Andean Adventures basically recounts the adventures, the missteps, the learnings, and some funny stories, perhaps, in terms of my experiences in the early part of my career, particularly in the three countries of Ecuador, Bolivia, and Peru. I went to Ecuador first as a Peace Corps volunteer, and I try to describe that journey within the book, as well as a series of circumstances that led me basically to stay on. I had perhaps somewhat prophetically joked with a friend when I left for the Peace Corps that I wouldn't be back until Reagan was out of office. And that's certainly the way it kind of played out. And in fact, it ended up cementing a vocation for me that took me around the world to different places.
So how many years were you in that area?
Well, in the Andean countries, about 13 years per se. Within Latin America as a whole, a total of about 20 years or so, because we were also in the Dominican Republic for several years, and we were in Nicaragua in Central America for about 5 years when I was already a commissioned officer with USAID as a Foreign Service officer.
So what kind of things were you doing over there?
Well, they varied. I mean, I started out working as a public health officer. Actually, I take that back. I started out as a rural public health volunteer. I'd received public health training when I went into Peace Corps, although I had studied a bit of public health and had at one point aspirations of being pre-med when I went to university, although organic chemistry convinced me of the folly of that. But originally, I was thinking that I would return to a political health policy kind of position, potentially actually run for political office when I went after finishing my Peace Corps service, and that proved not to be the case. I ended up really developing a vocation and a professional commitment to the area of international development and humanitarian assistance, and later had an experiential degree, master's degree in public health management. But my work wasn't limited just to public health. I ended up taking on responsibilities leading, particularly in Bolivia, as a non-governmental organization country director, a wide-ranging integrated rural development program that included not only public health, but also work in agriculture and animal husbandry and basic education. Later on, I would make the decision, the fateful decision, to join the US government as a career diplomatic commissioned officer. And I would rise up to become senior mission management as a deputy mission director and an acting regional mission director, leading one of USAID's largest missions overseas in South Africa.
Now, what prompted you to make that switch from the interest in the medical field to the direction that you went? Was it like a series of events, or just the lifestyles and the people that you met while you were abroad?
Well, probably some aspect of the latter. In reality, the needs and the design of successful programs, at least what I came to see working with different organizations overseas, went beyond just the public health field. There was always a need. I came to learn that there was really a need to address economic development, people's incomes. For them to make lifestyle changes and improve their health, I mean, they had to have the income to go with that. And thus, I looked for ways of being able to find donors and resources that would be able to complement what we might be able to get initially in the public health side. Later on in my career, as I worked in other parts of the world, in Central America, as well as in Africa, the issue of governance, the issue of corruption, the issue of accountability also came to play. And as I became a career officer within USAID, I had to take on really a more diverse range of requirements in terms of supervising programs and country missions within US embassies that weren't just narrowly focused into one sector, but were really wide-ranging and comprehensive.
And you mentioned economic development. And, from the perspective of, like, we'll say an average American, foreign aid to us just looks like a money pit. We don't really see anything happening other than we're sending a lot of money out. So what does economic development look like in practice when you're over there?
Well, let me just say that I think that the comment that you made is probably all too common for many Americans. And I think that it reflects really the incapacity, the resistance, I would say, of many organizations that work in the field of international development, and importantly, agencies like USAID and the State Department, to effectively communicate what does success mean. And though there is a wide-ranging bipartisan support within Congress for things like international development and foreign assistance, there always have been outliers, particularly on the Republican right over the years, that have tended to make the case that, oh, this is just money down a rat hole. Oh, this is just a waste of resources of the US. Really something that couldn't be further from the case. I mean, speaking as someone looking back over the decades, I have to say that there has been immense improvement, often or usually with the support of key donors like the United States, like the United Kingdom, like the EU, in terms of building up the well-being and the economic capabilities of countries that we're trying to help across the developing world, looking across the span of 20, 30, 40 years. That's not to say there haven't been plenty of mistakes. That's not to say that there have been problems of corruption and misuse of resources. Certainly when I was in Iraq and Afghanistan, I saw plenty of that as well. But I think there's also a disconnect for many Americans in terms of understanding what does the amount of resources that go into, let's say, official government assistance really entail. I think there have been a number of surveys by different organizations that have pulled out from the opinions of Americans the idea that somehow 5% or 10% or more of the federal government budget goes into things like that, when in fact, the US government budget that's dedicated to things like international development assistance and the United Nations and UN organizations represents less than 1% of the US government budget. Tony Fauci at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases and other leaders in terms of the pandemic response, I think have really tried to make the case during this last year with the coronavirus that any money that's spent internationally, globally, in terms of addressing health and trying to bolster the capacity of governments to prevent the spread of, for example, viruses such as we've had to confront in this pandemic, represents something that's really for our benefit, where we're trying to stop it before it actually ends up spreading to these shores. Many places of the world, like in Africa, looking at cases of Ebola, or South China, where so many different viruses really have flourished, and the kind of petri dish that that part of the world represents, really are places where it would be better for us to be forward-leaning in terms of supporting health and investment programs there to prevent the development of pandemics such as what we've had to deal with the coronavirus.
Yeah, I think a lot of them, it's a closed-minded idea that they just don't want to give money to other places, and that they're thinking we need to keep it. It's really an isolationist kind of idea where they just want to keep it interior, but they're not seeing the bigger picture of how we can help further other areas of the world that can become allies, or just by bettering them, it's going to better us.
That's certainly true. I mean, there have been plenty of countries that have been success stories as well over the years. I mean, South Korea, of course, is one very obvious example. I mean, South Korea after the Korean War was, an extremely poor country well into the 1960s, but through US government support, as well as investment of US companies, as well as the engagement that we had in other parts of Asia, such as Japan, built up these countries to be countries that were wealthy and were actually buying US production, US manufacturing and services. And there's many other examples beyond that.
I was in South Korea, and I think it was 2006, and it really looks a lot like America, just everyone's Asian. Like it's come a long way from what it was. Yeah. But you also have, I think, with all of this, you have this idea that Americans, a lot of the times when we travel places, we have this like following that everyone hates America. I never ran into that myself, but I also feel like part of that is because we're always we've got our hands in the cookie jars, and we're constantly reaching out, trying to help people. And whether we are or we aren't, some people look at that as a negative, in international affairs.
Yeah, I'm not sure that it's necessarily that side of things so much. I mean, certainly, this goes back to the 1950s with the book, The Ugly American. I don't know if you ever heard of it. It's kind of so dated now for people, but, one of the practical realities of how international assistance, foreign assistance kind of came to a greater understanding was when Senator Kennedy, before he was elected president in the 1950s, actually read the book and read the narrative in terms of attitudes of people in certain parts of the world that were so negative against Americans because of the perceived selfishness and reserve and lack of charitable contributions and the like. And he ended up buying copies for everyone in the US Senate to try to, increase an understanding for that. The thread of isolationism that I think you were referring to before is unfortunately been historically very long-lasting and very present in much of American politics. And it's understandable. Some people would argue it goes back to the very founding of, the United States back in American Revolutionary times. But we live in a world, where we have to be engaged. And certainly for our own benefit and to protect ourselves, we need to be playing an active role, not just in with the Atlantic nations of Europe, but also looking to the Pacific. I've spent a big chunk of my career in Africa. And the reality is that much of Africa was ignored to our detriment and peril until finally the Obama administration.
Is it still ignored though? I mean, so depending on how you hear about it, sometimes it sounds like it's still being kind of just swept. I mean, with the pandemic, even more so now, you're almost hearing that, like, I think it's the lowest nation for vaccinations.
Well, there have been a lot of challenges, and
always.
The reality is, if you look at different international statistics, there was some major backsliding in terms of resources to support different development programs, as well as not just development in the sense of kind of charitable contributions, but actual trade opportunities, the opportunities to invest, the incentives for American companies to go to those countries in terms of investing locally to take advantage of comparative advantages that they have. All of that declined during the past administration. And the challenge is going to be whether or not in the Biden administration that is turned around by the efforts of the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, and Samantha Power, and others in the administration.
So when you were working directly in the government, did you, I'd imagine you rubbed shoulders with some politicians when it came to things like foreign aid, right?
From time to time, we would have what's called CODELs and staff DELs. CODELs are when you have a congressional delegation, usually anywhere from 2 to 4 members of Congress from both parties that are coming out to actually take a look at where U.S. government resources are being spent. Staff DELs were usually more substantive when the staff from these different congressional offices would come out and do their own kind of fact-finding.
And did you find that their view of foreign aid on our end, the ones sending the money out, did they seem to kind of agree with the American public as far as, how we were talking earlier about a lot of them find it a waste of money?
Well, no, I'd have to say no. Now,
Okay.
Admittedly, this is probably a self-selecting group, because
Right.
if you're a congressman who's making the effort to travel to a given country,
Yeah, they probably already know.
Yeah, you're probably someone who's really motivated and interested in it, and who's been fluent in terms of the issues, knows what's going on, relatively sophisticated. Well, virtually all of my interactions with politicians who traveled overseas in that sense were positive. I mean, sometimes it showed that the understanding of certain people were not necessarily up to full par where you would like, but then that's the purpose of a visit overseas, where sometimes you have the opportunity to be able to talk informally, as they used to say, Moscow rules or Chatham House rules, where no attribution, and you could just talk freely and honestly in terms of what are some of the realities of what we're facing, dealing with different governments and different government leaders, how to best address the kinds of challenges that we may be facing with different countries.
That makes sense. And actually, Grizz and I are pretty well-traveled people, so we've crossed paths with, I'd say, a pretty good sample of the American population. And one thing that we can both agree on most of the time is that Americans, even as interconnected as we are now with social media and everything, are really insulated from especially underdeveloped countries. So without people traveling and interacting directly with these people, they're never really going to appreciate what the point of foreign aid is. And that's a new situation. How do we get these people to get on board with the idea of foreign aid?
It's foreign aid, but it's also the wider question of international relations. My wife and I were traveling in Europe in July and August, for the first time in a while, obviously. And we went to quite a few countries, including a few that we hadn't been to, that had been on kind of like our bucket list. And, our interactions were overall extremely positive with people, but it was telling that in certain countries, we encountered a certain automatic suspicion of Americans, particularly with regard to, for example, something like the CDC vaccination card. To be able to go into different restaurants and museums and you had to show either full vaccination or take a recent test in terms of COVID. And the Europeans, they all have these digital certificates on their phones that show their vaccination status and the like. certain people would question the CDC cards. Why? Because they had either encountered or they had heard stories of, some of which may or may not have been true, of other Americans who had been traveling with phony, fraudulent CDC vaccine cards. I mean, you really got to wonder, what kind of mentality of person, is there who would do something like that, and how that makes it worse for everybody else.
Yeah, it's definitely more of a selfish view, But I traveled the world for years, and never did I run into anyone who hated Americans. You'd always hear about it, but as soon as you sat down and talked with someone, whether you spoke the language or not, like within minutes, they'd realize what kind of person you are, and after that, it was no one cared.
And language is also an important part of it. I mean, as you say, it's language notwithstanding. I mean, you can build those kind of bridges and communicate with people, but it would help if Americans would be more conversant in other languages, at least one, ideally at least one other language. Many people you encounter are fluent in multiple ones. And, one of our most humbling experiences in that regard was in South Africa. We lived for several years in South Africa, and we visited South Africa off and on over a period of about 10, 15 years before that. South Africa, as a multiracial democracy, it may not be known to most people that it has something like 11 or 12 official languages and an amazing number of people, and not just affluent people, but including people of humble means, are conversant and fluent or reasonably fluent in at least 4, 5, or 6 languages. So it's rather remarkable, how people, even with not necessarily a great deal of formal education, are able to have that kind of ease to communicate through different languages.
Yeah, it did always amaze me, especially when I was traveling in other countries, that, even the least educated people in the populations of a lot of other countries speak multiple languages. And here in America, a lot of our most educated people only speak English. I think it's just a really short-sighted American decision.
I'm glad that I've had the chance to study a couple of languages over the years. I wish I had put away a few others.
I unfortunately started studying Latin, which was the bad way to start off with all of it, because no one speaks that anymore. But it's also, you're seeing English, I think, is spreading throughout the world. So a lot of Americans think, why should I learn anything? Everyone else is learning English. And it's not a lie, not to be a jerk about it, but it literally is almost everywhere you go.
I found in some countries where there were not just the kind of overlay of post-colonial kind of languages, be it Spanish, French, or Portuguese, there were also significant tribal languages. I mean, that was true across different countries in Latin America, indigenous languages, like through the Andes, where you have Quechua and Guarani and Aymara and the like. I found that I would get such a warmer and more positive reaction if at least I went to the effort to learn a few words of the indigenous language as a greeting, even if I was relying on the kind of colonial language for the country.
Yeah, if you're going somewhere and you don't even learn the greeting, you're just an asshole. That's simple.
Yeah, that's true. So having traveled for decades, assumed, right? How do you think traveling as an American now compares to when you started doing it back when you were younger?
Well, it's so much easier.
Is it?
Within the book, I recount, particularly my experiences as a Peace Corps volunteer, and then how I traveled after my Peace Corps service for several months, basically backpacking and through all sorts of hitchhiking, all sorts of means all across much of South America, down to the very tip of South America, of Tierra del Fuego, where I could actually try to jump on a freighter if I had wanted in Puerto Navarino to go to Antarctica. I ultimately didn't do that, but I was tempted.
That would be cool.
Just remembering the difficulty in terms of communication back home, in terms of, with currency, what technology offers today makes things so much easier. I traveled to, the Incan ruins of Machu Picchu outside of Cusco and other Incan sites back in the early 1980s, where really required a significant effort to go there. Now it's so much easier in terms of, paved roads practically and buses taking people almost all the way up there. It's not like the old days.
Yeah, I got to imagine that the world felt a lot bigger back then.
Yeah, and certainly your view of time changes. I mean, if I wanted to send a communication back home, I would use the aerogram, this onion skin that you would write a letter on and then fold on itself and try and mail it, and maybe it would get back in 2 or 3 weeks back to New York or whatever to my family. But now, of course, Peace Corps volunteers, before the COVID evacuation, everyone has a cell phone, everyone has internet. Even in many of the isolated places, it's amazing where you can find Wi-Fi. Although I have to admit, I ended up laughing multiple times when in different countries I would see, sometimes in semi-isolated places, sometimes in capital cities, people putting signs out, in their cafes or restaurants or whatever, saying, translating into English, "We don't have Wi-Fi. Talk to each other."
It's true. Now, I got to imagine being in Central America and South America for so long, you probably saw some pretty hairy things.
Yeah, and I tell some of the stories of some experiences with the military, falling into firefights, in different situations in Ecuador itself. At one point, I found myself in this central park of this small town about 2 o'clock in the morning, having left a bar with some friends, and I was trying to cross the park, and I ended up realizing that these sounds passing by my ear were that of bullets that were being shot from one end of the park to the other between the cops and military who were fighting each other. And other situations in Chile where I went down as part of a group that was monitoring the anniversary of the passing of one of the former Chilean democratic presidents under the Pinochet dictatorship, and with a friend who was actually a journalist for the Christian Science Monitor, and finding ourselves in a major attack by the police on people coming out of the cathedral and memorial mass, and having to escape from those circumstances. I had a number of run-ins like that.
Now, was that like that in a lot of the countries that you went to, or was it really focused on Central America where you walked into things like that?
Well, that's in terms of the South America, and in fact, in Peru,
yeah,
where ultimately I met my wife and our daughter was born. We had to face the threat of terrorism at that point from the Shining Path, Sendero Luminoso terrorist group that was active up until the time that the then president, who unfortunately became a dictator for a time, Alberto Fujimori, managed to squash it down. I mean, we were around car bombings and other sorts of terrorist threats just in the Andean countries. In Central America, actually, when we were in Nicaragua, it was relatively peaceful. My family and I lived in Nicaragua from 2000 to 2005 at a time when it was still a democratic government. It was about a year before Daniel Ortega from the Sandinistas would end up being reelected, winning office again, and then basically taking hold on an authoritarian basis, circumstances there. So we've been in a range of different countries, with ups and downs vis-a-vis the military and dictators and the like. In Angola, I had been in Angola at one point under World Bank auspices in the mid-1990s during the middle of the Civil War between two factions, one being supported by the Cubans and the Soviets, the MPLA, and another one, UNITA, that was being supported by the United States and its Western allies. And I'd had to be evacuated at a certain point when the Civil War got hot and we were facing, armed conflict nearby. But my family and I actually moved to Angola and lived for several years immediately after, about a year or so after the Civil War had come to an end. And, it was relatively pacified at that point, but certainly all the buildings around us showed the bullet holes and damage from what had been a particularly bloody Civil War.
And you had mentioned your family. So you had kids while you were traveling?
Yeah, our daughter was born in Peru. I married a Peruvian woman while I was working for USAID there the first time. And we went together to the Dominican Republic, to Nicaragua, to Angola, Nigeria. And then I had some separate, what they called unaccompanied assignments, where I couldn't go with family to Iraq and Afghanistan, where I was basically under protection of the military, as part of the respective regional commands or the provincial reconstruction teams. But then as a family, we also went to South Africa afterwards.
So have you had a chance to talk to your daughter as an adult about, growing up that way?
We've talked a number of times. I mean, actually, our daughter really had become such an international child from the start. I mean, she spent relatively little time in the United States. We were in the States for about a 2 or 3 year period while she was in kindergarten to the second grade, but all the rest of her time was overseas in different countries. And I think we viewed it as being a positive experience despite some difficulties, at times health challenges and also challenges of finding good enough schools, even good enough international schools for her. While we were in Nigeria, she did a year at an American school in Abuja, Nigeria, the capital, but it really wasn't the best quality. And she ended up, campaigning hard to me in terms of being able to go off to boarding school. And in the end, we found kind of a midway point for her to be able to go off to Windsor outside of London to go to the American school there, which was also a very enriching experience for her. She was close by, it was one flight of about 5 hours between London and Abuja, in which she could travel to us, so we could travel and see her. But still, I mean, she was exposed to so much, not only with London, but also with experiences and field trips to different countries in Europe. So she values that. And in fact, she found out that we were going to go off to South Africa while she was in her last year at American University in the Washington, D.C. area here. And she said, I want to go to South Africa. And I said, well, first, you're going to have to graduate college. And so she pushed herself to make sure that she graduated in time to then be able to join us in South Africa. And she spent a bit of time with us in Pretoria, but then went off on her own to Cape Town, which, is a real magnet for young people, and ended up finding some different opportunities for her work in advertising and marketing to at least be able to do a certain amount there, and ultimately ended up meeting her husband there in Cape Town.
That's cool. I've been a long proponent of having people, once they're either at high school or college, go see some part of the world. Like, if you don't, you're missing out on so much. Just culture, history, the whole works. You got to see it. It opens up your eyes towards everything.
Absolutely.
And it's not always quite that easy, as Grizz, I'm sure you know that. But I guess that's where things like the Peace Corps come in, which now that I'm bringing that up, that's not something that has really been commonly talked about, or really, it's not the forefront of anybody's mind.
You don't hear about it nowadays.
I don't think I know anybody other than talking to you here, Alonzo, that has been in the Peace Corps. Is that still in need of a lot of people to join that? Because, I don't even see any campaigning.
Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. For one thing, in practical terms, they pulled the plug on it.
Oh, okay.
During the pandemic. For the first time in the 60-year history, they evacuated worldwide all of the volunteers, for better or worse. It was a controversial decision at the time. A lot of volunteers didn't want to have to go back under those kind of circumstances. Some people argue that, look, many volunteers are young people. It's not universally true, but many are relatively young right after college, and we're probably less a threat in terms of any damage to health resources globally. But they brought back, at that time, I think there were 7,000 volunteers globally. Only now are they in the process of trying to reach out to those people who had been evacuated to see if they're interested in joining back up again in 2022. They're also conducting recruitment for new volunteers, as well as recruitment of new staff for Peace Corps. At its height, Peace Corps had about 10,000 volunteers overseas at any one time. It had been gradually shrinking over the course of perhaps the end of the Obama administration and the Trump administration. Their budgets were not being reduced, but they also weren't being increased. Peace Corps has had kind of a flatline budget for going on something like 5 or 7 years of about $400 million a year. But there is talk in the Biden administration of trying to revitalize it. I think, this is something that, again, it falls into the category of good deeds that we do that we just don't advertise and talk about enough. And I think Peace Corps, certainly for my life, Peace Corps was a transformative experience. I mean, it really did change my direction and caused me to take up a vocation that I wouldn't otherwise have done. I've known many friends who ended up returning to the States, but still finding that Peace Corps experience to have been really invaluable. And I do talk a bit in the book about the larger question of national service, which is something that also wasn't really talked about too much during the last political campaign. I think Pete Buttigieg talked a bit about it. Bernie may have talked about it a little bit. Biden really didn't give it much airtime. But I think national service is something politically, we should really be thinking about. We don't have a draft, and no one's talking about necessarily reinstituting a draft, although our volunteer military has a lot of design problems because, of course, we now have a situation where, with the lack of a draft and the way things have been, you have military service and military service obligation being taken up by an extremely small fraction of American families. And thus, it's not an experience that, the vast majority, 99% of American families have any kind of experience anymore with veterans or that kind of military experience. But I think that, be it military or be it domestic, be it civilian, there would be great value in terms of young people coming out from high school, perhaps before college, perhaps after college, and having some sort of civil service obligation where they would have to spend 6 months, 12 months, maybe more, learning some practical skills, being forced to work with people of all different colors and economic backgrounds and experiences, and being forced to, really have a wider understanding rather than necessarily a very segregated level of experiences. Because the US has become, unfortunately, particularly in the last 10, 15 years, an increasingly segregated country. Our neighborhoods, our schools, our colleges, our institutions, all too often, you're seeing kind of a resegregation taking place where people often just don't have any experience with others different from themselves.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that. The problem is, I mean, even nowadays, I think veterans in the United States is 6% of the population, but you're seeing a drop in actual military numbers. Like even with their budget cuts, they had to cut out people that Trump put in. But then on top of it, they're just like active military in general is not being as I don't know, like
Yeah, the younger
fantasized as it
people are
was
not
before.
pursuing it. I think the ideology of the younger generation has shifted away from that, which we brought up. I think it was I don't know, so maybe 4 months ago when we had Cole the Science Dude on. I brought up the civilian climate corps that the Biden administration was talking about, which I think is a fantastic idea because if you have an entire generation of civilians that are not really interested in the military, you can still end up with a form of national service if you give them other options. And if they're war averse, they can still get that opportunity with things like the Peace Corps and the Civilian Climate Corps. But they're just not talked about enough. And I actually don't know if the Biden administration is moving forward with that or not. I think it was just a proposal at the time. So we should probably look that up and get an update on it.
Yeah, it would be good.
Had you heard anything about that?
As well.
Oh, okay, yeah. I think it was instated for maybe 4 years or so, and I think it was in the 60s. And for the time that it was available, it was actually pretty successful. And combine that with the climate change that we have now, I think it would be probably one of the best things this country could do, expose people to other people in these situations where they're needed.
When I went into the military, it was right after 9/11, so everyone was wanting to go into the military. They wanted to do something. Now you're not having anything like that, really. So something like Peace Corps, Climate Corps makes a lot of sense. It's where people can get out. Maybe they don't know what they want to do in college. Maybe they don't know what they want to do outside of college yet. And they need to go experience the world more and see everything.
And I'm sure you mentioned in your book, Alonzo, the life-changing perspectives you can develop when you're in something like the Peace Corps, right?
Absolutely. Certainly, in terms of the kinds of people that you meet, things that you're exposed to that you would never have been exposed to otherwise. And again, I mean, the path that I chose is not necessarily a common one, but I know from friends who then went back to the States to successful careers, more conventional careers back in the States. Nevertheless, I mean, it certainly helped shape their understanding, their approach to different issues.
But also, I think going to other countries and seeing because usually you're going there to help them. When you come back to the States, because no matter how long your tour is, if it was 6 months, 8 months, a year, several years, or whatever, when you come back, you have a different appreciation for life and for the things you have or things that you don't have. If you just stay within the States, a lot of people have this idea that, that life is not good and that they need more things, when realistically, everything you need is around you. You just don't admire it as much because you've always had it. When you take yourself out of those situations, you put yourself in a place where you don't have air conditioning, you might not have electricity, and you're seeing the people around you who don't have a guaranteed meal all times a day. Like, that changes your perspective in life.
And you don't have to go overseas to see that.
That's true.
I think that kind of service is something that also could be offered domestically on these shores.
Oh, absolutely.
Sending people from one part of the country to another to carry out different types of reconstruction, rehabilitation, recovery projects. Even if it was for a 6-month period, I mean, would expose people to, new things that they wouldn't otherwise have been exposed to.
Yeah. Having a purpose like that too, I mean, that helps people out a lot. So many people can sit down in their life and they wonder what they've done, but say you went down after Katrina and you helped rebuild after that. Like those are things you can tangibly hold. Well, not tangibly hold, but like in your mind, you can be like, yeah, that's something I did, and have pride in that,
Unfortunately, our politicians and our political processes have been horrendous in terms of following through on some key incentives, that support things like that. I mean, you talked about your decision to go into the military after 9/11. I was flabbergasted with my wife. We were watching the 60 Minutes episode recently, just last night. In fact, we were watching it about they had these 10 military JAGs or former JAGs, judge advocates, who talked about their horrendously difficult efforts to take advantage of the benefit of having their loans for university forgiven after 120 months of paying down. I mean, it's one of the bills that were passed some years ago that provided that as a benefit of military service, along with other types of public service obligations. And amazingly, the statistics show that 90% of the people who've applied for that type of loan forgiveness and having fulfilled the intent of the law in terms of different types of public service or military service obligations have been denied their benefits because of ridiculous and inaccurate bureaucratic actions. And there hasn't been the effort made by the White House and by the Congress to really hammer the bureaucracy and to hold some of these bureaucrats accountable for addressing the shortcomings of that program. It just hasn't been anybody's priority.
Oh, no, not at all.
Somebody will be watching from that 60-minute show the other day.
Yeah, it's, I mean, even, going to the VA and stuff, I know a lot of people, it's miserable. The aftercare of our military members is not the greatest. But, I mean, on what you were saying with we don't even have to leave our country to do things like that. If you look at the homelessness that we have in this country and the budgets we have for that, and yet nothing is changing. We could send so many people and help in so many ways. And a lot of the times right now, you still have volunteers doing that stuff for complete free, but nothing changes.
No, it's true. And, I haven't been out to the West Coast in a long time, but you hear horror stories about San Francisco and Los Angeles and even medium-sized California cities and these tent cities that have developed. And, we've been living in the Washington, D.C. area since we got back a couple of years ago. And we see even in Washington, the proliferation of tents and other things that have been erected by the homeless. And I guess some people, by their measures, view it as progress that at least you've had, the giveaway of tents to provide some level of protection against the elements for the homeless. But what about dealing with the fundamentals of the homeless population's needs? And what are the drivers contributing to that? And certainly this has been something that people have been ignoring for far too many years.
The closest to us, Grizz, that has a real issue with that is New York City. And
we've got a tent city in Rhode Island. It ain't huge, but it's there. I don't know who the hell wants to live in a tent in New England. Good God.
That's problematic here. But if you go look in New York City, it looks like their biggest plan here for dealing with the homeless population is twofold. One is buy them bus tickets to Florida, and two is to put spikes down where they've been sleeping, which neither one solves the problem.
I saw the picture they had of the grates, the steam grates from the subway systems, where they had made it to where it was all wavy and had you wouldn't be able to sleep on it. It's like, oh, that's great.
Right. Well, as you know, Grizz, I go to New York City pretty often, and over the last 10 years, I have watched the evolution of the way they treat the situation. And there's always been homeless people when you walk through New York City, and they used to sleep on stoops and stuff like that, which occasionally you still see them do that. But as they've started to put these spikes down, the homeless population just shifted out further into the street. So now they're just sleeping in the middle of the sidewalk. And that's now, so you're not really fixing anything. You just kept them off the stoop.
Or you've exported them from Manhattan to the outer boroughs.
Yeah, they've done that as well. They move them around, and that's their solution.
Hopefully Eric Adams will, actually try to take it on. I think he's said some things about wanting to deal with it. I mean, I hope he's not going to come in as the new mayor with a kind of law and order ethos, as some people have worried. De Blasio, I saw, was on Morning Joe the other day, and he was offering some sort of regrets in terms of the things he failed to do during his 8 years as mayor dealing with homelessness. But my understanding is the problem has certainly gotten much worse over the course of this last decade.
Yeah, I would say just from my experience watching it happen, it definitely looks worse.
On the other hand, I mean, I grew up in New York City. We lived in central Brooklyn. We moved out to kind of an area in South Brooklyn near Mill Basin. That was Georgetown, Bergen Beach, that was being built at the time in the late 60s, early 70s. And I ended up attending high school in Lower Manhattan, so I would have to take the bus and subway every day to go to high school. It's amazing, how New York has changed compared to the days back in the 70s when I was going to school. I was talking at a reunion we had on Zoom with friends, and an appreciable fraction of my friends were mugged while we were going to high school. Luckily, I never was. I think I ran into one or two hairy situations, but nothing all that serious overall. And yet I was like a subway rat for years, going to school, going to visit friends, staying over the house of friends, and all of that, all across the city.
Yeah, I actually I brought my wife on her first subway trip. It was a couple of years ago. I love going to New York City. My grandfather's actually from the Bronx, and so every time I go to New York, I take the subway. I actually like it. But I took my wife there, who is from what I'll call rural Connecticut, and she hated every second of
it. Shame.
Yeah, I know, because it's great.
It's interesting comparing the New York subway with the kind of metros that we encountered in Europe. Now, Berlin, reminded us a lot of New York, particularly kind of the bad old New York with the graffiti and all of that that you would see all over some of the trains, not so much the trains, but particularly the buildings. We were in Portugal for a time, in Lisbon, and my God, the subway that Lisbon has is gorgeous. I've never been in Moscow, but I understand the Moscow subway also shares with Lisbon that sense that almost every station is almost like an art museum. And the trains themselves were gorgeous. I don't know if they're running bankrupt or whatever, like the MTA in New York is going, or the WMATA in Washington, D.C., but it's really night and day in terms of the experience.
Yeah, I've seen some pictures of the Moscow stations. Have you been to the new World Trade Center station? The one they refinished underneath, right next to where the building used to be?
Yeah. What were they called? Like the Oculus or whatever?
Yeah, I'm not sure what they call it. I think it looks like a whale skeleton, but when you go inside, everything from ground level all the way to the subway platform, it's all white marble.
That's cool.
Yeah, no, it's impressive. And we had a chance to visit it before the pandemic, and I'd like to go back and see it again. I also was listening to a podcast from Kara Swisher. I don't know if you've heard of her. She kind of does tech industry reporting. She's got her podcasts in different areas, but she was recounting having taken a train up from Washington up to New York and being pleasantly surprised and overwhelmed at pulling into the new Moynihan Penn Station, which I guess is like vastly better in experience, the new Moynihan Station, compared to the way Penn Station used to be some years ago. It was horrendous, probably one of the ugliest train stations in the world.
Now, with all these places that you've gone, visited, and lived, what was your favorite at all of them?
It's hard to say. On some level, there's that first love of Ecuador, which was really, apart from Montreal, Canada, it was the first place that really I'd gone overseas to spend any amount of time in, and ended up living in Ecuador for ultimately 5 years. I haven't been back in a long time. The last time I was back is 1991, in fact. But oddly enough, we've met Ecuadorian friends from time to time in different countries, including when we were in South Africa. We got close to the Ecuadorian ambassador to South Africa and some other friends who are Ecuadorian, and they've all urged us, oh, you have to go back, you have to see the way Ecuador is now and all that. So on some level, Ecuador is a favorite, but on the other side, South Africa, which is our most recent home, we were there for 3 years, and we left sooner than, frankly, we would have wanted to, in part because of shenanigans with the last administration. We've debated at times whether or not, in retirement life, that might be someplace we would want to go back to. I know my wife dreams of going back to South Africa, Cape Town, as well as other parts of the country. And we did have a chance to travel. And it's maybe a reflection of who we are and the kind of background that I had going into the Foreign Service, that when I was stationed in Pretoria with the American embassy there and as head of the USAID mission there, I mean, we made it a point, my wife and I, of driving into Johannesburg, the big city, which, kind of has a bit of a rough and tumble kind of tradition and history and notoriety. But we would go to Johannesburg with a tremendous wealth of cultural things taking place in restaurants and museums and whatnot very frequently, often once, sometimes twice a week. And unfortunately, there was a certain group, I would say maybe even almost a majority of the official Americans in the Foreign Service, particularly those in the State Department, particularly those that didn't have a prior Peace Corps background, who followed the strictures of the Regional Security Office and kind of stayed in their embassy bubble in Pretoria in the capital, thus missing so much of what the country had to offer.
I never understood people who did that. We had people that we'd be in other countries and they wouldn't leave. They would never leave their room. It's like, what?
They go to eat McDonald's.
Yeah, that too. It's like, we grew up in probably one of the youngest countries in the world, if not the youngest. And you're going to other places that are 3-4 times as old with as much history and culture, and you're not even touching it. Oh, okay. That makes no sense to me.
Now, that reminds me of a lot of people I know who have gone on vacation to, they'll say that I've been to all these countries, but they never really left the resort or the tourist area, which if you've ever been to another country and you go to the tourist area and then you go 5 blocks over, it's like a different planet.
Yeah, I almost never arrange any kind of a formal tour. I made an exception when our first stop was Iceland on this recent trip to Europe, because we flew Iceland Air and took advantage of an opportunity to spend 5 days in Iceland. But I ended up paying for a self-guided tour where we got a rental car and we basically drove on our own, but we had a kind of a semi-planned itinerary and we traveled across. We spent only about a day and a half in Reykjavik, the capital, but we spent the rest of the time going along the southern part, along to the eastern coast of Iceland. And it was an extraordinary experience in terms of the kinds of things we got to see and experience.
What country blew you away the most?
On this recent trip?
Or just in general?
In general.
That could be a tough one.
That is really.
That's why I'm asking it.
I mean, it depends to a certain extent on what you mean by blew me away. I mean, on some level.
It could be a positive, it could be a negative. Well,
on the negative side, after finishing my first tour in Iraq, I was asked to provide kind of senior level assistance in Afghanistan for a number of months. And I went to Kabul, and then they asked me to go down to the Southern Command in Kandahar to provide support, particularly in Kandahar city, and working with the regional command in that part of the country. And I was in lots of meetings with Afghani interlocutors, and I went down with military support, of course, down to some diverse areas of Kandahar, including down to Spin Boldak on the Pakistani border, and participated in different shura, these councils of the tribal elders and all that. And I never really felt safe, truly safe, anytime that I was there, either outside or even inside in the base, because it was a very small and completely inadequate base that I was staying on, this Camp Nathan Smith, that had been designed for some 300 Canadian troops, but the Americans had taken over and had put in 2,000 American soldiers, or about 100 and 150 civilians, and it was just woefully inadequate in terms of sanitation and security and what have you. But I compare the experience in Afghanistan, where I always felt a lot of mendacity and mistruth and lying and hiding different things, and the possibility of betrayal always there under the surface, unfortunately. I mean, I came to know some Afghanis that were friends, particularly those that were helping out as translators and all that for the team. but it was very different from my experience in Iraq, where I was frankly in also some tough situations. My military force protection friends in Tikrit, in Salahadin, in Iraq, would joke that I was a bullet magnet because I had to go out to Tikrit a number of times, and there was a sniper who seemed to be particularly gunning for me, perhaps because they kind of
thought you were
identified
important.
this sucker as somebody who we should try to target. Visiting the Tikrit University and the medical school and other parts of that environment, where a lot of the Saddam supporters had retrenched to, and but nevertheless, within that situation, I always felt a much warmer, friendly, engaging kind of situation with the Iraqis, and I have much deeper friendships and contacts and ties even to this day with people I came to know in different parts of Iraq.
Now, with you spending time in Afghanistan, what's your thoughts on how it all ended?
It broke my heart, the whole situation, both in terms of what was happening on the public scale as well as privately communications that I was part of with friends who had been in Afghanistan who were trying to take direct action to push the State Department bureaucracy in terms of getting these special immigrant visas for people who had served, and the tremendous delays in terms of getting people. I knew really the best case was actually not even American, but with this Canadian, with this Afghani translator who had gone off to Canada and had managed to build a life in Canada. And she had tremendous support from the Canadians in terms of locating and being able to evacuate her family from Kabul and other parts of Kandahar. She'd originally been from other parts of Afghanistan. She'd originally been from Kandahar. But I am of mind that the best time to leave Afghanistan really should have been no later than after Osama bin Laden was taken. That was the time, and I forever begrudge Obama and the Obama administration for not finding a way of overruling the idiots on the other side that stopped him from pulling out forces out of Afghanistan at that point. And then, even if that, as folks on MSNBC like Chris Hayes and all that have been saying, the best time was then. The second best time was at least now. I mean, admittedly, it was sloppy, it was messy. I don't know what they were doing in terms of the communications of things and the systems to get people out, but I didn't think we had any place for staying any longer in Afghanistan.
Yeah, no,
yeah,
I agree.
we did an episode on that whole situation. It's just pretty unanimous, I think, for the people we were talking to, that was probably the best time from our view too. Is we should have pulled out back then.
Well, after that, you lost all your public support.
Yeah, and as Grizz said on that episode as well, we were still there, so we had to leave.
The reality is, back in 2011, when I was there, I mean, yes, there was corruption. Yes, there was Taliban infiltration. I personally in Kandahar, dealt with having the mayor of Kandahar and the governor of Kandahar assassinated by these turban bombers that were popular at that time, and that unfortunately the idiot security from the ANA, the Afghan National Army, and all that, they somehow never got over their hesitation to actually pat down and check to see if any Afghanis coming in were carrying IEDs or anything under their turbans. I mean, it was something that was almost impossible to get them to understand. An amazing number were assassinated at that point. But had we left at that time and basically confronted Karzai and his corruption at that time and said, okay, we're leaving, we would have left at a time where Taliban forces were only in control of maybe 25% of the country. And things were not predetermined, and necessarily they would have been able to, do anything approaching what ultimately they ended up doing over the ensuing years in terms of taking over more and more. I mean, that's the paradox, that had we done it, and if we'd forced the Afghan government to really take the measures that they had to do in terms of better inclusion, better engagement, better dialogue, and all the like, we would have a far happier situation in the ensuing years and ultimately what was faced there.
Yeah, my thought was, and the further you got away from when Osama bin Laden was actually assassinated, the worse it was going to be. So it needed to happen. And they knew that. And that's why it was sloppy as hell, but they did it anyways.
I mean, Obama, to his credit, admittedly constantly under attack from the Republicans in the Senate and all, he did pull out the American forces from Iraq, and they followed a strict timetable. It did, from my point of view, lead to what I felt was a premature closure of many of the provincial reconstruction teams that the US government was supporting, which gave us eyes and visibility out across Iraq. We had to close down virtually all of those by May, June of 2011 to take into account the departure of American forces down to Kuwait by December of that year. But, Iraq went through a lot. I went back subsequently, and I was there at the time when ISIS ended up invading in the northwest, coming over the border from Syria, and seeing the horror show from their attack on Mount Sinjar and their attack on the Yazidi population living up in Mosul and the like. But nevertheless, I mean, I think Iraq has played out in the end with far greater stability because of that decision to ultimately pull out and to kind of pull the rug out of, certain forces in Iraq that were just determined to keep up the constant attacks on the American military presence.
Now, was corruption the worst in Afghanistan, or was there somewhere worse than that?
Oh, I think it was terrible in Afghanistan. I think it had been. There was corruption
everywhere.
There's corruption everywhere.
Yeah,
but I think
some places worse.
Where you have a situation where you got people flying into the country with suitcases and pallets of dollars, and they're just spreading the money right and left with no accountability. Of course, you're going to be fueling, giving an adrenaline shot to any of the existing corruption forces that exist. To that extent, I mean, I think that, in fact, under the Trump administration, the one bright spot one could say, in my mind, in terms of appointees that, gave forth a message that made sense was what I saw within USAID with Ambassador Mark Green, who was a former Republican congressman from Wisconsin. He'd been the leader in the creation of the Millennium Challenge Corporation. He was appointed by Trump as the administrator of USAID, and he managed to, on the one hand, successfully buffer, much of the craziness that was coming out of the State Department under Rex Tillerson, which was a total nightmare. Not 100%, but at least somewhat. And then the other thing that he did was to argue persuasively this idea that the purpose of foreign assistance should be to end the need for foreign assistance. And, that was an idea that was initially a little controversial, particularly for those on the liberal left wing who thought that this was just a disguised attempt at pulling the rug out from foreign aid. But actually, it was part of this larger effort of what was called the Journey to Self-Reliance, in which USAID ended up developing this strategy where each country would end up getting a report card following the use of independent indicators that would look at their capacity and then their commitment in terms of addressing different social indicators. I think there was something like 17 different indicators. And corruption was an important part of that. It was certainly a part that in which they had to be held, different host governments had to be held accountable under that commitment in terms of ensuring that they were really going to dedicate their own resources to different social investment, socioeconomic development areas, and to try to reward countries that were able to demonstrate that, yes, they were putting their own money into different development and investment activities and infrastructure needs of the country, as opposed to building palaces for every idiot that was, temporarily holding space on the toilet in the presidential palace. So, I mean, I think that was actually a positive step. Unfortunately, there was a lack of follow through in the end. Green ended up leaving for the last year of the Trump administration, and that ended up really pulling the rug out of a lot of stuff that could have continued, given some shenanigans that were coming from the White House and the burrowing in of a lot of these ideological political hacks that were being appointed by the White House Personnel Office. Yeah. I think, I hope that Samantha Power at USAID now and Antony Blinken will really find enough courage and political support to make investment in terms of addressing the need of climate change and these other global challenges, while still holding different governments accountable on the question of corruption and the right use of their own resources.
Now, did it ever come up internationally with the countries that were getting these report cards? Did they ever bring up the irony of the American government grading someone on corruption? Because ours is pretty public now.
Some did. Some of course, raised that type of contradiction. Certainly, the Russians and the Chinese used every opportunity to try to parrot that. Mark Green, though, was a pretty good communicator who could humbly indicate to people that, look, we're not saying that the U.S. is a paragon. There's corruption here as well. But at least in terms of, our ability to extend a hand and to offer assistance to countries in need, there has to be that recognition that we're going to work mutually on this issue of corruption. And not only corruption, but the larger issues as well of what they were calling in South Africa when I was there, of state capture, where you have elites, these different entrepreneurs and local business elements, local elites, who would end up being able to suck out government resources that were local government resources that were destined for, different development and construction projects, infrastructure projects, and the like. That ended up becoming quite the hot potato. And at least in the case of South Africa, it ultimately did lead to the reckoning of their former president, Jacob Zuma, who's now been confronted by a host of charges of corruption and is facing prosecution by his, the justice authorities and the judiciary under his successors, Cyrus Ramaphosa, who's, has something of a little bit of a dark history years back, but at least in recent years has been trying to make things cleaner and to hold himself to account.
Wasn't Zuma the one who didn't know how to actually say numbers?
That was it. He was also the guy who said that, he could avoid AIDS after sleeping with his girlfriend without a condom by going in the shower.
Yeah. Did you hear about that at all, Jerry? He had to say something like 638,095 and he couldn't say it. It was hilarious. But I mean, it's also sad. But
it's a disgrace.
Yeah. But I think going forward, these next few years are going to, especially hopefully coming out of the pandemic, we have a lot of work to do. And it's going to be interesting to see how we do it and where we go.
Yeah. And Alonzo, with the knowledge you have available and your insider perspective, what do you think the next 10 years is going to look like with international relations, especially focusing on foreign aid coming from the United States here?
Well, I am by nature a guy, kind of the glass is half full kind of guy. So I do try to be optimistic in terms of the way things go. At the same time, I did recently read Admiral Stavridis' book, 2034. I don't know if you've seen it or read it.
We actually had
the co-author on.
I'm gonna draw. I can't remember his name.
Yeah, I mean that was a sobering book in terms of
It was.
The events with China and all of that. Of course, I think it's easy to overinflate the capacity of and successes of China. I think China is facing their own contradictions as a competitor, and they're gonna have a hard time of it looking to the course of the next 10 years. Looking at demography, looking at the aging of their population, looking at the fact that they've, under President Xi, they've managed to alienate a lot of countries that were predisposed to be allies to some extent of China within this great global competition. And so, given their behavior, now their additional threats that they've been making with Taiwan, their behavior in Hong Kong, their threats against Australia, I think they're creating a very, very difficult situation for themselves. And I just hope that there isn't any kind of spark for a flashpoint that makes things ugly before they ultimately resolve. But, I think a lot rides on the course of the next several years. It's easy to say, but it's also our practical reality that we've got to wash out of our system this paradigm, this lunacy of authoritarianism, of just these anti-constitutional stances that are being taken that are fueling right-wing extremism, domestic terrorism here in the United States. If we're able to get over the hurdle of that and get to some point where we can have a reasonable and balanced two-party or three-party system, in the future, then I'm optimistic that somehow we'll stumble our way through and we'll be able to try to tackle the challenges that we're likely to face in terms of dealing with inequity and social justice, racial justice here in the States, global climate change, and the like.
I'm hoping we're at that point.
At heart, something of a spiritual person. Sorry to cut you off, I just want to finish quickly the thought. I mean, I came to know of, and I talk about a little bit in the book, in terms of my own journey, I came to appreciate on both an intellectual and a spiritual level the Baha'i international community and Baha'i teachings. And that ended up also providing me with a philosophical foundation for looking at the future in a more positive light, in the sense that I think, there are these forces of destruction and negativity, but there are forces of creativity and positiveness that ultimately will push back, hopefully, the darkness.
Agreed. I hope that right now we're at a point where we're either seeing a change with the two-party, and maybe we are going into a three-party. And this is the reason we're going through so much heartache and headache right now, is that we're coming up to that crest to where we can get over it and become a country that might actually see eye to eye on things.
I was listening to a podcast with Andrew Yang the other day, and I'd heard that Andrew Yang was abandoning the Democratic Party.
He did, yeah.
Talking about forming another party. My immediate reaction was negative, like probably a lot of people. I thought, just what we need. But then I heard him talk about it and this movement that he has called Forward, and it actually made a lot of sense. I mean, he basically was referring to the success that has been found in different states and municipalities that have taken up ranked voting as an approach.
Ranked choice voting.
To being able to count the vote. And he's basically arguing that we've got to focus on doing that across the board in many different states as a way of being able to counter extremism on both sides. And we've got to introduce the incentives so that Republicans and Democrats and independents will have an incentive to come towards the middle and find solutions that, maybe don't offer 100% of what we want, but at least 80% of what we all kind of agree on. So I did regain some enthusiasm for what he was saying.
I also think that part of that, I mean, you listen to a podcast, I have to assume it was probably, an hour or more?
Yeah.
One of my biggest things with politics nowadays is we never hear them talk for any length of period to where they can actually explain what the hell they're saying and why they're thinking it. And that needs to change. Is a huge one. I'm not a huge, I was never a big follower of Bernie Sanders, because when you listen to him right off the bat, you're like, man, this dude just wants to give it all away and you don't understand what the hell's going on. Like, how are you going to fund all this? But then when you actually sit down and listen to him and live for 2 hours or so, you understand where he's coming from, why he wants to do it. Now, he may not know where the funding's coming from yet, but you can understand from a personal point that, okay, I know where you want to go now. And that's a big part we need to change.
Same thing with Michael Moore. I mean, I think Michael Moore has often, been kind of rendered in a cartoonish kind of way because, often a lot of times it's just short clips of things that he would say. And some of his documentaries have been viewed in different lights. Of course, documentaries often have a certain purpose as well that tend to go into that whole polarizing. But if you listen to Michael Moore kind of talk things out on a more measured basis with some good interviewers and kind of challenge him a bit on different questions, he comes off sounding quite reasonable.
Which, if you don't listen at it, he doesn't sound reasonable at all.
Well, that as a fellow optimist, I actually, over the course of the last 6 years or so, as this country has gone through the pretty dramatic ups and downs, I actually view it as difficult, but a very good thing right now, because we've now unearthed all these problems that were either hidden or people just weren't talking about them because we didn't really need to.
We had the blinders on.
Now everything's exposed and we can really see the issues that we have and have the opportunity to work through them now. I
think you're right, Jerry. I think that transparency and bringing things out into the open is the first step to being able to go forward.
It's a difficult path to grow, but I think it's the best direction for us to be going right now.
Encouraging any of your listeners who are curious, who want to learn more, to consider going to my website, to look on Amazon at the book, which is available on Amazon in paperback, ebook, and in the next couple of days, hardcover edition, as well as an audiobook version. And I hope to be able to have a subsequent volume as well of my African and Asian experiences following up on it later this year, hopefully.
I'll have to pick it up. I always like when you hear that we're going to have an audible version, because I listen to things while I'm driving.
Yeah, no, the audiobook is up there and it's done pretty well in terms of reviews. Let me tell you, it was a real learning experience for me. I decided to do the narration myself.
Oh, yeah?
And I did the editing, and I had a good mentor and coach on it and all that. But it probably took me anywhere from 7 to 8 to 9 hours of work for every hour of recording.
Yeah, that's not shocking.
The book is about a 10-hour adventure in itself. So it took me about 100 hours to pull the whole thing together.
Well, we're glad you were able to get that done. What we're going to do is we're going to post a link for the listeners here, so you guys can go find his book without having to go search for it. You can go right from this podcast to the link. And Alonzo, we really appreciate you being on. And this was, again, a great conversation.
Thank you very much. A lot of fun. And definitely, I'm going to be listening more to this podcast.
Yeah, we go all over the place.
Well, Grizz, that was something.
You sound like you're asleep, Jerry.
I know. I'm just kidding. I liked talking to Alonzo. It was a pretty interesting conversation and kind of highlighted what we talk about here from time to time on the show, that people, especially in America, really need to get out more.
Oh, definitely. I enjoyed talking to him. I also thought it was cool that we got to get a perspective of someone who's been to Afghanistan a couple times and what his thought was on the withdrawal and everything.
And it was really interesting to get the perspective of someone on the foreign aid spending that the U.S. takes part in, from the perspective of someone who's actually been been there seeing what is happening. Like, where's that money going and why are we sending it there?
Well, it's easy to sit on the other side and be like, all right, we're dumping tons of money into other countries for what, and with him, it kind of explains where it's going and what we're doing.
Yeah. So I've softened my position a little bit on foreign aid money and giving money to other countries. I mean, we do have a lot of issues that we're pretty much ignoring here in the United States, but after talking to Alonzo, it's pretty obvious if we stopped helping these other countries, we're going to run into some trouble.
Well, I mean, what a lot of people don't realize on the other side, and we talked about in the episode, is, we help these third world countries kind of modernize and become non-third world countries, and then now they're allies and they can help us in other ways. So
yeah, and if we didn't do that, they would not be our allies, which means if something were to happen, it's a lot more likely they would end up on the other side.
Yeah, or you have something just turn a complete shit show like we're seeing in parts of South America, where
and we don't need any more of that. The world is getting much smaller. The last thing we need is more of those conflicts.
Thank you again for listening to Beautiful Bastards. New episodes every Monday. Remember to like and subscribe. The older you get, the better you get, unless you're a banana.
Foreign assistance is not an end in itself. The purpose of aid must be to create the conditions where it's no longer needed. Barack Obama.
Had to do it in his voice, huh?